Hello and welcome to my studio. Today I'm doing something slightly different. I got hold of some vintage watercolour paper, about 30 or 40 years old. It's WHATMAN watercolour paper that used to be used by many loose watercolour masters, and I'm really excited to try it, to test it out and to see if it still works well as watercolour paper after all these years. I also got hold of some De La Rowney Bockingford paper, a vintage pad, and that looks like it's about the same sort of age, 30, 40 years, maybe a little bit older than that. The paper looks in good condition. While I won't be testing this one today, if you enjoy this video, then I'll take a look at the Bockingford and see how that works out. But today I'm looking at the WHATMAN. I've got some small sheets, and I've got some larger quarter imperial sheets here, and this is one I'm going to be trying. It's £200 weight cold pressed watercolour paper, and I'll be giving it a go to see whether the size is damaged and to see whether the paper still works. It was considered to be the Rolls-Royce of watercolour papers in its day. All the experts used it, and I've really wanted to try it out for quite a while. You can see the WHATMAN watermark here quite clearly on the back, hopefully, if I hold it up against the light. It's made from 100% cotton, and it was so revered and so missed when they stopped making it any longer that St Cuthbert's Mill, that makes Saunders Waterford, created Milford watercolour paper as sort of in homage to WHATMAN paper, and they claim it's very similar. So I should be looking forward to trying this paper out because I love Milford paper. And as long as the sizing has remained intact on this vintage paper over the years, it's going to be quite exciting to paint on it. This is my reference photograph from Pixabay. The link is in the description below. Just before I start though, Morgana, who runs the channel with me, has got a new video up on her blog, a speed paint showing you how she painted this beautiful spring flower scene. So why not pop over to her YouTube channel, Morgana Rose Art and Wildlife, and say hi. She's got some wonderful demos over there, including this fabulous speed paint. The link to her channel is in the description below. Here's the simple sketch. Pause the video if you want to refer to this for today's demo. And I'm just going to have a nice strong cup of coffee and then I'll get going. But first, I'd like to just quickly plug my book, Landscapes in Watercolour, Techniques and Tutorials for the Complete Beginner. It covers everything you need to know to get you started with watercolour painting, along with 10 step-by-step demonstrations, 5 pure watercolour and 5 line and wash. There are links in the description below if you're interested. My board's at an angle of about 20 to 30 degrees, so gravity will help with the painting as usual, and I'm using my large Princeton Aqua Elite wash brush to wet the sky. I'm coming down and wetting into the river. The paper seems to be taking the water okay, although I'm having to work a little bit harder to get the water onto the surface. This is cobalt blue, so I'm painting in my sort of late spring, early summer sky, just with plain cobalt blue, leaving a few white unpainted areas just to give the impression of a few clouds, bring it down over the horizon line. I can clean out my brush, squeeze all the water out of it and just lift a little bit of paint or soften back areas here and there just to give me a fairly soft sky. And at the moment everything seems to be diffusing well. From that point of view, it makes me think that the size is okay. I've painted on paper with damaged size, and very often you end up with like spots and marks appear when you start to paint that weren't visible to start with, where the surface has become aged and damaged. There's nothing like that here. This is sap green, and then sap green with a bit of burnt sienna in it to put in that sort of mid-ground tree line. And then getting in my river banks, still using the same brush, trying to get everything in very loosely, very roughly, with a big brush to start with. And then I can work on sort of finessing the scene slightly towards the end. This is raw sienna and some raw umber for these lighter sort of strawy banks. and then using the tips of the brush with a bit more blue, dragging a little bit of the raw sienna into the water just to create the river, which is reflecting the sky. And I forgot to mention, I have sped the video up a little bit. I don't usually paint quite as frantically as this because it's quite a long process when you're testing something out. Here I have added in some Payne's grey and sepia into the green, and I'm darkening it. But back to that observation, I think you can see that the paper has begun to buckle quite a lot across the middle. It's quite wavy from the water. Now with £200 paper, I would have expected it to stay a little bit flatter at this stage, as it's a heavier weight paper than what I'm normally used to. But then I remember that way back in the day, it was traditionally accepted practice to always pre-stretch your watercolour paper. These days we don't need to do it quite as much when we're practicing, but it's still a good idea to do so if you want a really flat paper. So I'm observing here that I think this paper needs pre-stretching to keep it nice and flat as we paint. And it feels a lot softer to me than the surface of Milford, but my washes are behaving in a very, very similar way. And I'm very impressed with it actually. It's such a shame that it's not still available because I'm finding it quite exciting to work on. You can see that it lifts out really cleanly as I scrape through the rich paint with my palette knife to reveal some sort of highlights on trunks and branches and things. And the texture is really nice, it's a very natural texture to work on. Trying to lift out a bit of that green there because I want to keep that a little bit lighter and get some raw sienna in there. And even when the paint's wet, I was able to lift it out quite nicely. So that's a big plus point for this paper. Just adding texture, building up the scene, trying to sort of get in the impression of that path on the left. And I'll just continue across the scene, then putting in some branches and trunks just before the paint dries on this tree on the left, and I'll put in some reeds along the riverbed. I think the fan brush has given me some lovely effects for the reeds and some texture on the borders between the mid-ground trees and that bank. But I've just flicked in some spatter of sepia and Payne's grey, and I'm not particularly keen on that. I don't think that's done anything for the foreground on the left, so I'm sort of trying to rub that out a little bit. But it is what it is. Sometimes we can have an idea and we can try it out and it doesn't quite work. So we can decide whether to try to mend it or whether just to move on. And in this case, as I'm just testing out the paper, I've decided just to move on. And it's now time to let all of this underpainting dry. And it's just about dry. It's taken quite a long time to dry, in actual fact, so this paper stays open and damp and workable for longer than most papers that I've tried, modern papers that I've tried. So again, that's a point in its favour, and another reason why it's such a shame it's not available. I'm just putting in some grey, some very pale watery grey, to give me those distant mountains, just to give a little bit of extra depth and distance to the scene. Working this time wet onto the dry paper, and so I can get harder edges. I have to work to soften the edges by either sort of softening them back with a clean damp brush or smudging with my finger. Just getting in a few sort of highlights into the river, a few shadows. Number 2 quill brush that was. I'm now going to work on picking out some detail in the trees and the reeds and the riverbanks here and there using my number 2 rigger brush. I'm going to finish the painting off with some shadows from the tree across the path. That helps to define the shape and direction of the path. And I'm going to use my artistic license to put in a shadow from a tree that's out of sight across the path in the foreground, just to kind of help lead the eye into that corner. I think I just need to darken that sort of mid-ground hill behind the tree a little. And that gives us that better contrast between the lighter part of the field. And here's the finished painting. And I'm fairly pleased with this as a first try at this sort of scene, but especially pleased with it as the first go at using a completely different watercolour paper. And it is very different from the papers that I'm used to, and yet similar in the same way. I really enjoy the kind of soft diffusions and effects that are created. The paint seems to granulate out more on the paper, and it seems to stay sort of wetter for longer as well. I think the colours look clean and bright. As I said before, the diffusions are soft and gentle, and yet we get nice, crisp, hard edges with wet on dry painting. Just a real shame that it's not available, but I would agree. I think St Cuthbert's Mill have done a really fine job creating Milford watercolour paper, which is very similar to paint on. So if you enjoyed this video, you might want to try and get hold of some Milford. I'm always drawn to old-fashioned antique and vintage art supplies and equipment, and if you enjoyed that, let me know. I used to be an antique dealer before I became a full-time watercolour artist, so I'm more than happy to try out more sort of vintage materials and equipment as and when I come across them. So let me know if you'd like to see more of that in the comments. So many thanks for watching. Please leave us a like and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. And if you'd like to support the channel, then please follow the links below to Patreon and of course to my book. I'll see you again soon. Take care and happy painting. Bye.